the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is openness to the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we begin today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly we do have a Patreon account available at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month, perhaps more, and we will, in return, in reciprocity, you will gain access to our Discord server. I'm going to be rather truculent and say that no one's doing this type of work. We have an absolute banger of an episode forthcoming, and so consider that, and we hope you enjoy this discussion, which will focus on Richard Seaford's Money and the Early Greek Mind, but we're going to do so much more. Strap in, get ready. I will toss it to my esteemed colleague, Taylor Atkins, to maybe lead us in with your thoughts in terms of the reading this week, and we'll take it from there.
To double up on your, truculence, on your adamantine will. We're also doing some good shit in the reading group. The schizoanalytic cartographies, we've got a nice group of about a dozen people, sometimes 15, coming in and listening and contributing. We're trying to figure out what Guattari is doing there. So it is worth, if you guys are interested, we're going to be pretty much keeping the reading groups going. We're always going to be looking at the kind of philosophy that Coop and I talk about on the show. If you want to be a part of that community, please send us $1 a month, come join the Discord and hop in. As for Seaford, this was kind of an interesting, another one of those serendipitous texts that I saw something on Twitter, I think kind of was like, hey, this looks like something you'd be interested in. And then you looked into it and were like, absolutely, this goes into the kind of research that we've been doing. So Seaford, he claims to be I guess he was a scholar of Greek tragedy, but
a classicist.
A classicist,
but not in the negative connotation of a classicist.
not a classicist, but a classicist. So he does have some chapters on Greek tragedy, but he expands obviously his view. He starts with Homer. He goes into some of the tragedians, and then spends a lot of time, I think, for our purposes that we were really interested in, although the Homer shit is good too. We were interested in his arguments about the development of philosophy in Greece, the pre-Socratics up to Plato and Aristotle, because Aristotle talks about coinage and money directly. He has some provocative arguments about the development of coinage in the 6th century BC and how that inspired thinkers like Anaximander and Pythagoras and Parmenides and Heraclitus and yada, yada, yada. I would say with Seaford, to start us off, I did think this was a topic I didn't know much about. And so to see something so empirically grounded, because that's another good thing. He draws on a huge body of literature and historians and thinkers, and he has an empirical basis for his arguments. And he also does some pretty close literary readings, which kind of, if you will, straddle the transcendental and the empirical, or the speculative and the empirical, right? He's able to build a nice launch pad of empiricity with historical dates, with archival work, with archaeological findings, with historical background, and to make this overarching argument about the birth of coinage in Greece. And one thing I would say, just because this was something I wanted to, before we start our conversation, I thought it would be helpful for the reader readers here, you with your ears, you're reading with your ears, you're listening. He lays out several aspects of money. Obviously, money can be broader than coins. And so the question of when money comes on the scene in whether it be in Greece or in China or in India, he's asking a kind of more particular question about coinage, but he does lay out aspects of money. And so I'll read that list, and that might be able to just set the ground because that's kind of how he starts off the book. Aspects of money would be the power to meet social obligation, the aspect of quantification, provides measurement of value, general acceptability, which he excludes from an exclusive acceptability of guilt, right? You pay for murdering someone's family member, but also exclusive acceptability. So there's an interplay between generally acceptable and exclusively acceptable. And then a concept that I hadn't heard of, but makes sense, he calls fiduciarity, which is the future confidence that the coinage or the money will have the monetary value ascribed to it because of its state sanction and control. So all of those aspects, social obligation, quantification, measurement of value, general acceptability, exclusive acceptability, fiduciarity, or future confidence in the conventional value, and state sanction control. All of those are aspects of money. Some things like bullion and these earlier forms of storage of value, some things meet to more or less extent all of those criteria, but coinage particularly kind of embodies and cuts across all of those. And there are other aspects of coinage that he will bring up, like its storability, its durability, its exchangeability with obviously with other coins, but with commodities, blah, blah, blah. But quantification is something that I thought was interesting too, uniquely for coins, because a lot of the coins names comes from standardized weights. But anyway, I'm kind of jumping ahead. Those were just the bundle of aspects that he is looking at. And I think one of the most interesting of which is the concept of fiduciarity, which you and I texted about a little bit. The main thing with fiduciarity to me that seemed to stand out was that obviously coins are generally, obviously, I mean, today they can be based on metals that we don't find particularly valuable, right? But some of the earliest were made of electrum, which is an alloy of gold and silver. And then when electrum was able to be cemented, I think there's a process where you can separate electrum into gold and silver. Then you have silver coins and gold coins and blah, blah, blah. But the fiduciarity is how coins are worth more than the metal of which they're made. Otherwise, they would be melted down. So the conventional value exceeding the use value or stuff value of the gold or silver or electrum it's made of, that is a question of desire, a question of confidence, a question of a social solidarity, a basis of future belief in the disparity of the conventional value and the quote unquote use value of the metal stuff of which the coins are made. I thought that was an interesting concept that I don't assume he made up. It's probably maybe a concept in numismatics or historical coinage studies. That's the basis for which he looks at talking about money and says, I think he makes a convincing argument as you read through the whole book, says that yes, coins are not Greek coinage, this 6th century kind of invention, which happens in Greece, in India, in China, and Persia a little bit later. He makes this argument that there was money beforehand, obviously value, there was exchange beforehand, but coined money in particular, what he calls monetization, had a profound effect on Greek culture and Greek thinking and Greek institutions. And so I think that's the overarching basis of his book. And he starts with Homer and shows Homer doesn't really, in Homer's world, you don't really have coins. There might be like one mention of something like a coin or coinage. It's actually later in the 6th century with the development of the pre-Socratics, that coinage historically comes into being. And it doesn't seem for Seaford to be a coincidence by any means that coinage comes into the world, and what we think of as the quote unquote birth of philosophy in the West comes into the world at around the same time.
If you really kind of think about how bizarre it is, the sort of cognitive faculties and capabilities and necessities that would preclude the exchange of money, which, again, which you pointed to with regard to the coin having less use value than its exchange value. I'm going to give you this piece of metal, this rock,
Right.
what's basically amounts to a fucking piece of a rock, and you are going to give me in return a loaf of bread, let's say, that I can actually subsist on and get calories from and live on. We're historically situated in a particular regime of habit where there's an unconscious
Right.
process that mediates interaction, exchange, right? And so I just want to highlight how bizarre that is when you really start to think about it. And so you can really get to the point that Seaford reaches. And also, I think Alfred Sohn Rethel writes about this, whom Seaford actually responds to as well. His critique sort of goes to Kant and the 12 categories and so forth being not these eternal, a priori, transcendent or transcendental categories of cognition, but these being relative productions from the material process that began in the exchange of, that manifests itself through the social relation, the physical exchange in the material world via coinage. And I think that's a really fascinating thought. And if you really start to think about it, and if consider yourself a materialist of any stripe, I think that's a fascinating thing. I think that aligns with Deleuze in certain ways with respect to, I don't know if you would consider it a problematic per se, but there's a certain force to thought that occurs with respect to the exchange of currency, in which the use value doesn't match the symbolic or the exchange value, right? One must begin to hold this transcendental idea in the mind that this sort of general equivalency sort of installs itself in a sort of Leibnizian fashion, which I'll get to. And I think I've mentioned in the past with this kind of notion of capitalism as a theodicy. So I might have slipped up a bit there, but I think the general thrust of what I wanted to foreground is there.
I would say, because I see where you're going to go with your threads, I guess the one thing I would say that I thought was interesting, well, there's a lot of things I thought was interesting, but I did think about, and maybe we can come back to this, I assume you'll want to, but I did think it was interesting the way that he gives pride of place to the Homeric tales, the Iliad and the Odyssey, to look at what we might call a pre-monetary society. And by monetary here, we mean like before the advent of coinage, not obviously the advent of anything that could be used in exchange, right? Anything that could have a money function, but specifically this pre-coinage society. And interestingly, his emphasis, which he's written about earlier, about reciprocity and distribution and all these things, that I hadn't thought about it because I probably haven't read enough literature on the Iliad, but it is very clear the way he was talking about it is the Iliad begins with a crisis in reciprocity. Agamemnon's being kind of he's doing the thing that Freud talks about with the primal father hoarding all the shit, right? He's not being equitable in the distribution of the booty and the loot. And it causes an issue where Achilles is like, well, fuck you. I'm not gonna go and fight for you. Seaford looking at the communal aspects of the collective sharing of whether it be in warfare of distribution or redistribution of goods, which seems to be a function of the group, but also seems to go through the proclivities of a leader like Agamemnon. And then reciprocity of gift exchange, which you and I have talked about at length and with other thinkers like with Mose and forgetting his name again. I always forget his name. I'm like memory holding him. Violence in the Sacred. What's his name?
Girard.
Gerard, thank you.
But also, what was the woman who wrote about gift exchange versus contract exchange? I'm blanking on her name,
Yes.
so maybe you
Well,
can.
it's
In reciprocity, you have to provide the mnemonic.
because we almost read her book on the Vestal and the Fasces on Hegel, but we read her other book.
The eroticism of
Schrader.
contract. Right.
Anyway,
The eroticism of contract and gift, which I'll have to link in the show notes, as well as the mouse or Mose rather.
and so I really liked him starting with the pre-monetized society and really giving that a lot of breath and setting the stage for Homer society too. He argues is even depicting a society that's before the central location of a temple. Not that there wasn't worship or altars or anything, but the actual like temples were being built in this around the time of Homer's compositions. And it's in the temple that not only communal sacrifices are distributed equally, but also where something like the accumulation and storage of value could allow for something like coinage to take place, because he is looking at the conditions of possibility for coinage. And so not just what does society look like before coinage, but what are the things that we need going on for coinage to become necessary and possible.
Yeah. So that, I think, dovetails nicely with the first of the threads that we want to follow, which would be that money decodes flows. The second foregrounded thread is the theodicy of money and the market. 3 is hauntology, the market, and the primal father. And the fourth thread is simulation and hyperreality. The working through line here to give a sort of philological, historical genealogy of the form that Marx, Postone, Deleuze and Guattari, Lacan, and Baudrillard are all theorizing in different registers. The pre-Socratics are not intuiting capital, but they're articulating a cosmology of a society that's undergoing monetization, the shift to monetization in actuality in real time. And so by the end of the episode, you'll be able to hear Heraclitus, Aristotle, and Anaximander as the cosmological face of this operation, whose contemporary face winds up looking like the Amazon delivery or the algorithmic warehouse.
As I mentioned to you before the episode started, Seaford does turn to Lacan at one point. I forget which chapter. He's looking at arguments around the phallus and yada yada. I know we may or may not really look at his discussions of that, but you can imagine he does say things like when you say money decodes flows. He looks at these contemporary authors like in Plato or in, I'm trying to remember if it was perhaps Parmenides or someone else who seems to have disparaging things to say about coinage. And he makes the point, which seems like it comes straight out of Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, right? That money is general equivalent, which is not just Marxian, but Aristotelian, this idea. Money as general equivalent is sort of equalizing disparities between rich and poor, and also kind of fucking up local valuations and etc. Right? And so the aristocrats aren't too happy about coinage, at least in certain aspects. They might be happy about other forms of coinage and the embodiment of value that they can store and hoard. But at least initially, he kind of shows some of that fear with regard to the decoding of the flows and the leveling of the playing field, because money and coinage is circulating amongst the poor and the wealthy alike.
So the thesis of the book in one sentence would be: monetization in archaic and classical Greece produces the cognitive, affective, and metaphysical conditions for what we would retrospectively refer to as Western philosophy. The corollary here is when continental theory critiques abstraction, equivalence, the unitary subject, the self-grounding ground, it's not analyzing eternal categories like Kant would posit. It's actually analyzing the historical sediment of the monetary form itself. Again, pointing towards a materialist critique or, I don't know, historically materialist critique or understanding of money and the way that physical or social processes generate the transcendent. This is why I bark on and on about Dune so much, is because I think Herbert intimately understands the way in which it's the physical and the social processes, material practices of exchange and relationship and communication and exchange of information, even a dialectic, a soft dialectic, perhaps with our environment, whether that be the quote unquote natural environment or our social environment. But those practices are what gives or what generates the transcendental or the transcendent. I might be fucking up that, but I don't have time to worry about that. That all to say that it's the material practices that develop the religious form.
I suppose in Herbert, while there may not be coinage, would spice be sort of the general equivalent, the economic monetary type of flow, or would there be others alongside that I'm just not familiar with?
Water would be, for the Fremen, would be their general equivalence of value, and they have a way in which they represent the value of water in the water rings, which are sort of analogous, points to a type of a coinage within their internal economics. And one could have, despite being part of the tribe, one could amass a certain amount of water wealth within the tribe represented by water rings. But I don't want to piss people off by going down that rabbit hole too much.
I guess I wasn't thinking of the Fremen in particular, but that makes sense.
You were thinking of the Imperium. They do have,
yeah.
It's a Solaris is the actual currency of the Imperium itself. But Herbert doesn't really get into the minutia of economics of the Imperium in that way. It's all very broad. He's working with at the sort of macro or molar understanding of these to some degree. But I guess he sort of balances that in some respects. There's another tradition, the Vernant tradition, which would be that, and I think you could speak to this point as well regarding isonomics, because there's a argument in this sort of classicist world of academia that pre-Socratic rationality emerges from the isonomic political form and the cosmic order modeled on this civic equality. Seaford is in the other camp where creon, which would mean debt, is not a political category in the way that Vernant would say or argue. So the centrality in pre-Socratic vocabulary points to monetary and not this political ground for philosophical abstraction. And that's a major debate that we don't need to get into, but I think it's interesting to know the kind of competing strains of thought. You did mention something related to Karatani's work, I believe, and isonomia, and that has some purchase with Deleuze and Guattari, if you want to talk about that briefly.
That's a text that we could look at a certain point, but I will say he seems to be saying Vernant is wanting to look at the development of these political forms as the genesis, the motivating factor for these metaphysical doctrines and developments. And Seaford seems to be saying, and he doesn't put it this way, but he seems to be saying that Vernant is kind of begging the question here, because he doesn't get to, at least in Seaford's mind, Vernant doesn't give us the reasons for which these political forms start to coalesce. And it's not enough evidence for Seaford. It's just not convincing enough, right? And so put in light of monetization, Vernant's claims suddenly take on a lot more concreteness, and the political can follow in line with this material economic argument. It's not that Vernant is necessarily wrong, but the puzzle is missing a number of pieces, and the emphasis is put causally on something that's more indirect than the directness that Seaford's trying to argue with the advent of coin.
So back to the four threads that we're going to braid here. Again, number one is decoding, the destruction of qualitative codes by a quantitative axiomatic including the decoding of bodies, which I think is very important to foreground. Not only the decoding of sort of commodities themselves, but of bodies, right? Because we're really talking about, in terms of what capital is doing, is it's metabolizing bodies. It's metabolizing organic life, and it is metabolizing that and transforming it into ordered, structured, dead capital. And then that dead capital is dominating and accruing dominance over the living, over the sort of N-1. In terms of theodicy, right, it's the harmonization of conflict as the form of every transaction. And this speaks to the notion behind all exchange, or like potlatch, if we want to think about that, right, which is the sublation or the sublimation of conflict between parties in terms of the violence of an exchange. In the potlatch, there's a competitive aspect of trying to give the gift that cannot be reciprocated. So there's an escalatory nature of conflict that is trying to be socially mediated by the universal transcendent signifier of monetization, or the coin. Hauntology and the primal father. So money is the immortal remainder of the ancestors. It's the impersonal master that has no master. It's not immediately that coins reflect the likeness of the tyrant, or maybe I shouldn't say tyrant, maybe I should say the sovereign. But I think there is certainly a persistence over time of sovereign likenesses being portrayed on coins. And I don't think that that's by accident. That still applies, right? Today our money says, "In God we trust," "out of many one," with "e pluribus unum." I think these are all values that go back to ancient classical Greece. There's a certain democratization that is offered or enabled by coinage, right? Because there's an equivalence that can be an abstract equivalence drawn between bodies and between commodities. The fourth thread, simulation, hyperreality. The coin is already third order simulacrum at the very moment of its emergence. So I have a radical reinterpretation of what simulation and hyperreality are. I will perhaps be doing a course through the Acid Horizon Research Commons. I proposed that to Craig. That'll be perhaps this fall. We'll see how that goes. But I think I've got a radical reinterpretation of that. But nice. I won't belabor that point too much. And we'll jump into thread number 1, which is money decodes flows. There's a passage from Sophocles that has an ethnography of this decoding. I'm going to butcher these Greek words. I'm going to try my best. Arguros, which would be silver, silver or money. Mm-hmm. Seaford has 3 different verbs that are doing structural work. The first is porthai, which porthai, laying waste to cities. The second is exanise. I'm not even going to try that, but it's expelling men from homes. And then I'm just going to not even try. There's too many syllables for my American brain to process. But teaches and transforms minds is the kind of translation we would sort of perhaps point to. The progression here is not a rhetorical escalation. It's a precise descent that's walking us through the territorial scale. So from polis to oikos to interiority. And then at each of those 3 levels, it's a similar operation. And that's the dissolution of qualitative codes and the substitution of the quantitative flow. So again, think general equivalence between bodies and between commodities. Transferring the qualitative difference, the N-1, into quantitative flow, so N+1. Sophocles has a phrase, "every act of impiety," and this is the subject who can now compute any act in the single currency that dissolves all other measures. And so this is sort of what Deleuze and Guattari would refer to as a generalized equivalence, and what Marx calls the universal equivalent. Socrates names it kakiston, which is, I think, is interesting because I'm sure there's a tie to, what is it, kakastrophe, or I'm fucking it up. I'm not.
Well, there's the kakistocracy, right? So kakos is like bad, evil. So Kakistan is like the worst or the most evil here. So yeah.
If we're quoting Deadwood, this is cocksucker, basically.
Mhm.
Anyways, so the line here that's going to compress the whole operation: wealth makes a good man bad and a bad man good.
The only way to stop a bad man with wealth is a good man with wealth. The
But money is the root of all evil, bro.
love of money. Yes.
So this is the formula for a general equivalent operating on what's supposed to be a qualitative determination. Once everything becomes convertible through money, qualities don't subsist on their own ground, right? Because I think exchange is indifferent, capital is indifferent to quality is an argument that I've made. And that's sort of one of the general problems with it, is that there is a certain democratization on one hand, there's a deterritorialization at play with respect to the decoding of flows, but there's also at the same time, on the other hand, there is a recoding, a reterritorialization taking place because the qualitative difference is being flattened. These qualitative differences become predicates that money distributes and redistributes. And that's the structural condition for what becomes real subsumption. The form doesn't just exchange against pre-existing qualities, it begins to generate the field of qualities as its own effects. And I think that this generation of the field of qualities as its own effects that's very important. I don't know if Simondon would agree, but to me, in my ear, in my head, this sounds like there's a certain Simondonian resonance here. I don't know if you would agree, but what do you think? As
Yeah, I
far as
mean,
generating the pre-individual field of qualities.
if we think of coinage in terms of techne, in terms of a technology, if you recall in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, he refers to the way in which technical objects create their own conditions of possibility. So this is kind of how I would see it, right? As coinage in its as it is becomes adopted and takes on and develops fiduciarity, right? So that's part of the field, is the field of desire and beliefs that invest it with the conventional value that exceeds its use value. That's a part of the field effects, right? And so coinage gives rise to this distributive field in which it can become general equivalent through the means of desire and belief. It's kind of an interesting, you could say chicken and egg, but it's not an important thing. What comes first, the desire or the belief, or the material coins? I mean, probably most would argue the coins, but for the coins to have cachet, you need the belief, desire. I would think that he would describe that as effects of a field, right? Because as Seaford makes clear, until coinage, societies without coinage, pre-monetary societies in that sense, are not, for these ancient thinkers, are not predisposed to the same types of things that Sophocles is referring to. Coins don't have that power of general equivalent and therefore cannot turn a good man bad and a bad man good, blah, blah, blah. So there is a sense in which there is in the advent of coinage, it does have a certain reach, at least insofar as its conventional value outweighs, not to pun, its use value. Outside of that field, you might be able to use those coins, but only insofar as they actually are made of silver or gold that has a certain purity, blah, blah, blah.
An etymological note that's worth mentioning here: the verb paralasai in Sophocles transforms or alters thoroughly is etymologically related to alagae, which would be what, family?
Alage.
Alagae, yeah.
I'd have to look that up. I don't. Let's look. Alos is other,
Which
right?
makes sense because exchange, alteration, the very
So
word for the Exchange Act itself.
I guess the para and then the alase. So para alase. Okay, yeah. So let me look. You said that means family, alage.
I
Let's
believe
look.
so, yes.
Okay, alage, ancient Greece. It means in general change or exchange, barter, buying and selling, economics. I'm not sure about family, but I do see it means change or exchange. Alage from allos, other, right?
Sorry, related to the Alage family, I think, etymologically.
Okay.
Sorry, I
Okay.
fucked
Yeah,
that
yeah,
up in my notes.
Okay, now it makes sense. Yes, yes. So that makes sense.
The interesting thing here is that money would transform minds by exchanging them, by making them subject to an exchange form. And then the recoding of interiority itself becomes an exchange operation. One thing we want to note, and I think this could be captured back in terms of Deleuze and Guattari and what they refer to as, what is it? The phrase something is like a little suppleness will not save us. So
yes, yes.
the decoding of flows is not a liberation. There is a certain democratization in terms of coinage and its operation, but it's not a liberation fully, because on the other side of it's a deterritorializing force, but on the other side, it reterritorializes in the sense that it flattens all difference. To put
you
it
could
bluntly.
also, you remember the thing that they look at with Marx, right? If it's liberating in the paradoxical double-edged sense that Marx talks about. It was only when capitalism comes about, only when men are free, when there's a freedom in a double sense, right? They're freed from slavery, right? Because capitalism and slavery are different modes of production. The freedom they have is the freedom to sell their labor power, right? So there's a double edgedness to the liberation, if there is one.
Going back to the Schrader book, right? The assumption is that gift economies have a lot more suppleness than
We assume
contract exchange, which
yeah.
contract exchange sounds very rigid on its face, but whenever you really begin to interrogate the conflictual dynamics at play with respect to gift exchange and the rigid obligations themselves, it's money that actually begins to free the individual from social obligations and reciprocity, and that becomes the problem. That's the decoding of the flows operating. The three phrases that Sophocles references with respect to money: cities laid waste are not free cities, men expelled from homes are not free men, and minds transformed are not necessarily enlightened minds. Decoding is recording by an axiomatic. Flows are being resubjected to a new and more abstract capture, and that's the form of money itself. And Sophocles' grammar here is telling the story in terms of argyros is the grammatical subject of every active verb in the passage. Persons appear only as the patients of an operation whose subject is the medium itself. And that's Marx's kind of, I'll just say automatic subject.
Yeah.
So that I don't fuck up the German. So value in motion. This is being articulated, interestingly, 2.5 millennia prior to Capital Volume 1 being authored by Marx. A third strain here is going to be our operator that we've come up with for our manuscript, the Petite Mort A, in an archaic dress. So through Aeschylus and Agamemnon, the Agamemnon gives us Ares as the gold changer. And the structure is bodies out, homes made of or turned to ash, and the Atreidae accumulating. Richard Seaford's phrase for what the chorus registers is, quote, the hideous exchange of incommensurables.
So the lives of the soldiers for gold or money.
In the Iliadic economy, Zeus is the Thames, the distributor, the monarch overseeing redistribution, who holds the scales as a transcendent arbiter, right? And we begin to see money itself takes on the role of the transcendent arbiter overseeing distribution. And when you can begin to see how theodical,
The
theodicy, but maybe I should, would it be theodical?
What is the adjective form of that? The theodician, the theodicy with, now you can say it, spell it like
I think
Odyssey as
theodical.
well.
I think theodical is what I'm gonna roll
Yeah.
with. Who begins to hold the scales of exchange under capital? Perhaps it is God. In a certain way, in God we trust with full faith and credit of the United States, for example, but it's the sort of transcendent signifier of money, the invisible hand of providence. And if you begin to think, we'll introduce Hayek, I think, as the grand priest of the capitalist theodicy a bit later on. But in the Aeschylean shift, Ares is a party to the transaction, exchanging living bodies for gold dust. So again, this is a metabolism of the living, of the n-1, of the qualitative into the n+1, the ordered, the sort of dead, right? Think of that in terms of thermodynamics as well, right? The sort of chaos or disorder of living beings into the ordered form of matter, right? Dead labor.
And I will say that Seaford points out numerous times that in Homer's, so you were just referring to Aeschylus, right? A little bit later in chronology. So in Homer's vision of the Iliad, Achilles, after Patroclus is killed, he basically is like, he's going to kill every Trojan on sight, and he is not going to take any ransom because for him, it's already preordained for him after Patroclus dies that he knows he's going to die as well. So gold doesn't mean anything to him anymore. He's not going to trade his life or his suke, his soul or life, for money, because that's the incommensurable thing. Whereas in Aeschylean tragedy, we're now seeing that Ares is a party to this transaction and is literally trading suke, life, soul for gold. This is partly why it's tragic rather than epic, right? Achilles is not going to enter into that type of exchange because it is incommensurate, lives and money, his life in particular. Whereas in the tragic vision, that's exactly what's going on. These mercenaries, for example, which Seaford does point to, along with other historians, for the need for coinage. What's one of the needs for coinage? Well, being able to not just interact with trade, as Aristotle thinks. There's something even broader, the ability to pay for mercenaries being one of them. So
I think, or social mediation in general
yeah.
as well, right? Because I think points to one thing that Baudrillard argues relative to death is inexchangeable. In terms of something like the structure of terrorism itself, there's no general equivalence for the qualitative lives that are lost. And the value of the hostage is their innocence is what generates their value. And their lives, their qualitative lives, there's no general equivalence in terms of money or even violence sake that would necessarily balance the scales in terms of reciprocity. And this is something that Girard points to with respect to the sacrifice and the mimetic violence. What threatens the social is a mimetic violence. MCM prime as it pertains to the blood feud. There's no end to the blood feud. One can continually exchange body for body. One can apply a general equivalence to bodies. But as we see Achilles argue, there's simply no equivalence for the soul. The soul transcends value.
You said a key word, innocence. I know it's not Greek, it's Latin, but the etymology there, nocere is to kill, and innocent is one who has not killed, right? So it's kind of interesting, even there, that a seemingly innocent word like innocence already it contains what you're describing.
So this passage is marking a historical moment when death is brought inside the circuit of monetary exchange. Obviously, we refer to the problematics that brings into, or that, the problematics of general equivalence as it applies to death. But I think certainly you can begin to see or draw allusions to the exchange of the living labor for dead capital. Crucial moment is the chorus's resentment lands on the Atreidae, but the Atreidae are not the operator. They're an artifact of the operation. Ares is the actual trader, and the Atreidae rather, are an n+1 effect of the gradient that they don't actually control. This is giving us a pre-capitalist witness to the petit mort a, which is the operator that's converting n-1, so the spent body, into n+1, the police as surplus-bearing entity through a totalizing exchange. Next point we'll move to would be Aristotle's MCM prime as form and not an ethics. So Aristotle isn't diagnosing greed He's identifying a form that has no internal limit because money lacks a qualitative determination. No limit built into its form is the operative phrase. MCM prime doesn't merely lack a limit, it destroys limits. It deterritorializes. It decodes. It dissolves whatever qualitative determinations it encounters. And the form's content is precisely the negation of form as limit. If you want to think about this in terms of Deleuze and Guattari, capitalism is always pushing and reinforcing or decoding its own and recoding its own limits. Its tendency towards its dynamic limit, not merely unlimited, capital is reaching as it's pushing on its own dynamic limits. And so once or effort enters the formula, as it does for Aristotle and explicitly for Marx, the analysis is no longer about merchants accumulating coinage. It's about lifetime being subsumed under the form, under the value form. Aristotle is righter than he could have known, which is interesting, I think, to point out how Aristotle, I think we would perhaps consider Aristotle an enemy, generally speaking, but I think the relationship between Marx and Aristotle is probably underappreciated with respect to Aristotle already in the emergence of coinage begins to see the threat of the decoding of flows. And I think perhaps even more starkly because the habit, the sort of habitualness of it, the habituation hasn't really become so concretized.
If Aristotle's an enemy, it's in certain of his ontological presuppositions, his, I don't want to say glorification, but his standardization of hylomorphism. But in the politics, when he is talking about money and wealth, the art of wealth getting, chrematistike, right? He is very much part and parcel of this fear of the decoding of flows, right? Because he very clearly states and is very much aware of the way in which the money not only is giving, has the lack of limits that one might see in the oikos, right? The limitations of the oikos and the polis those limits can be transgressed and threatened by the unlimitedness of money and the desire for money, the art of wealth getting. You brought up Marx. I mean, Aristotle's notion that money begetting money is unnatural, which would be counter to physis. Marx says, well, it may be unnatural, but it's a thing that happens. This is how capital comes into being when the money lent gives birth to the money of interest. When money becomes filial, this unnatural filiation, that's capital.
This was an interesting point. I forget where this even generated, but with respect to the prohibition against incest, money begetting money is a type of incestual reproduction, just to put a flag in that for people to consider. But back to the decoding of flows, I think we want to mention briefly the Lydians, Lyotard, and the general equivalence of bodies. And Herodotus is giving us a philological detail that does some structural work. He reports two facts about the Lydians. The first is they were the first to coin gold and silver. And the second is that all Lydian girls earned their dowries through prostitution. He doesn't present these as connected, but if you read this structurally, it's the same fact stated twice. Coinage and the systematic monetization of female bodies emerges together in the historical record. And that's not a thematic resonance. That's one event that's reported twice. What does this offer, this decoding thesis that we've been building? Sophocles' three verbs targeted polis, oikos, and mind. The Lydian passage adds the missing fourth term, which is the body. Decoding not only dissolves territorial, kin, and cognitive codes, it dissolves bodily reproductive codes. All political economy is libidinal economy. And that's from Libidinal Economy by Lyotard. The body becomes a unit of exchange at the same moment the coin does because both are facets of the same operation. The conversion of qualitatively determined substance, which would be the kinship body, the dowry conferring body, the reproductive body, into a quantum that circulates in the universal equivalent grid. You had something you wanted to add?
I was just saying that This is in chapter 4, Trade of Libidinal Economy, pages 167 to 172 or so, that he goes through all of this in relation to our discussion, but also in relation to the kind of imminent homosexuality involved with the Lydian koinonia or collectivity. Leotard,
Koinonia? Interesting, right?
yeah, that's the.
That can't be by accident.
I don't think that relates to coins. Yeah, it's related to community, but the word coin, I'd be interested to see, actually comes from the word for wedge and stamping, which is interesting, from like cuneiform. So not the same. It is a little bit of a coincidence, but I only brought it up because I know we won't necessarily have time to talk more about Leotard, but it was definitely in the background for you and me when we were reading, and it's worth for the listener if they want to follow up. This is like kind of Leotard at his best in this book. There are other places, obviously. You've probably heard Coop say "Hold me tight and spit on me" a couple of times throughout our episodes, but the listener can also go back and refer to our series on libidinal economy.
I want to bring up David Graeber here and his work on debt. In pre-monetary human economies, women functioned as a standard of value. And the medium itself was often something else like cattle, copper bracelets, brass rods, calibrated against this woman standard. And the Lydian moment is the moment the standard function is abstracted from its embedded reproductive context and routed through metal. Prostitution is what happens to the woman as standard at this threshold of conversion into woman as currency. She is forced to be the medium her body had previously calibrated. So coinage and the brothel are the same institution at its founding moment. The military coinage slavery complex of the axial age, which Graeber tracks in detail, is the systematic generalization of this originary operation. We have a line with Levi-Strauss, Irigaray, and is it Go? I'm trying to think of how Gox would be in French. There's a historical anchor for Levi-Strauss framing the exogamic.
Yeah. So exogamy, right, from the outside. They talk about the despot in Anti-Oedipus as exogamous, right? It comes from the outside to sort of render everybody incestuous. This is a whole argument. But the better example would be the way in which Seaford points out that a lot of the early Greek legislators are actually not from the city state that they are legislating for. There's something objective about an outsider coming in and setting up laws for the populace. They're not biased. So they're exogamous. They're outsiders.
In the Levi-Straussian context, this is the exchange of women as an operative form of social bond between groups, right? So this goes back to the prohibition against incest and exogamy. Gu traces the homology between the gold standard, the phallus as a transcendental signifier, and the abstract general equivalent. Irigaray reads the patriarchal monetary apparatus as inheriting the structural function of women as exchange objects. Each of these could sound speculative on its own, but Seaford's philology gives us a line that anchors all of them. The inheritance is not metaphorical. It's actually documented by Herodotus historically. Leotard's read of the Lydian passage. In libidinal economy, Leotard takes the Lydian girls as an emblem of generalized intensities being routed through the equivalence form. It's not desire repressed by capital, but desire flowing through form. So desire flowing through the form of exchange or money or monetary exchange. Libidinal intensities dispersing themselves into the exchange grid. The body opened, its surfaces spread out. Every patch of skin becomes a possible locus of exchange. Leotard insists on registering this as the libidinal operation it actually is, with an affirmative first that the operation actually carries for some of its participants. So this would point to "Hold me tight and spit on me," or the madam that Leotard refers to in libidinal economy taking enjoyment or extracting jouissance from the encounter, and not by sort of taking pleasure in being objectified, maybe. Anyways, this sort of provocative refusal of moralism by Leotard The descriptive claim is what Seaford's philology supports. At the origin of coinage, libidinal intensity and monetary equivalents are co-emergent. For Petit Mort A, this is the most literal historical instantiation that the operator we've created has. The little death is sold, the orgasm exchanged, the vital expenditure of the body is the n-1 that the form converts into the n+1 of the dowry, of household formation, and of the polis's reproduction. Petit Mort A is not a Lacan on Marx anachronism. It's the operative form of the originary monetary transaction that Herodotus is reporting. The Lydian girl earning her dowry. Go ahead.
Just to make it clear, Coop, Leotard himself is pointing to Herodotus for all of the knowledge we have about the Lydians and prostitution. Because I had forgotten that until it took me a second to be like, why is he talking about Herodotus? No, it's Herodotus gives us in his historical account that the Lydians had this practice. Anyway, go ahead, Coop.
The Lydian girl earning her dowry through prostitution is the structural ancestor of every wage transaction.
That's a big one.
And so that's pointing to, I have this notion or this provocation rather that every exchange is an exchange towards death. Every exchange involves both creation and destruction, eros and thanatos, in a single moment of creation. You can think about this in terms of money creation, even, right? Because at the Federal Reserve, in their computers, whenever they generate money, they generate both the positive and the negative ends of the spectrum of the field itself, right? Because on one hand, the money is created, but on the other hand, so credit is given, but also debt. There's a simultaneous, I mentioned before the fusing of eros and thanatos, which I think you took a little bit of issue with, but I think maybe fusing would be not the right verb to use. Just to point to the simultaneity in the act of reproduction and the act of reproduction of not only, really the social and the sexual act of reproduction, energy is being expended. There's a certain risk being taken and borne. So there's a death, there's a loss of time, of chronos, of the qualitative for reproductive capacity. So the body's vital duration is converted into a quantum that persists after the body has worn out. And read that way, the wage becomes the secularized form of the dowry, and the wage worker is the ungendered descendant of the Lydian girl. Points to Leotard himself, basically making the point that all wage labor would be prostitution. One is giving up one's body and using one's body as an object. The contemporary completion, platform sex work, so something like OnlyFans or the cam economy, let's say, is the Amazon delivery of the Lydian institution. The body being decoded, the libidinal flow routing through the platform, the algorithmic intermediation that conjures the transaction without anyone occupying the position of the master, right? So two phenomenologies of one transaction are taking place. One is the dark zone of the worker's body, and the second is the manifest surface of the consumer's gesture. So that makes the bodily content unmistakable, and we're going to develop a little bit about this Amazon issue later on. But the Lydian segment is what guarantees that this analysis lands on bodies and not just on supply chains. This is going to push forward to thread 3. All that remains of the ancestors, they are the pieces of money. So that's hitting very differently after this Lydian passage. The bodies that wore out in the Lydian brothel left the dowry coin as an immortal reminder. Money as the distillate of mortality. And the mortality being distilled is materially the mortality of women's bodies put through the equivalence form first. The bridge to the second thread is that the decoding is one face of the operation. Again, dissolving cities, homes, minds, and bodies. The other face is what makes this feel like order rather than horror, and that's the theodicy. But go ahead.
I think it's important too at this point, since you're going to the theodicy of money market. Obviously, Leotard is going much, much deeper into the background, because this isn't Seaford's main concern, this question of Herodotus, Lydian prostitution, etc. This is something that Leotard brings out very clearly in libidinal economy. But it does intersect very well with Seaford's analysis because he's working with historical record and with the records we are left with by people like Herodotus, who are pointing out that the Lydians are given credit historically for the invention of coins. So that would be the one thing that I would want to stress here after your analysis of Lydian prostitution, which features in Leotard, is that it's interesting too that the Lydians are credited with developing coinage and monetization that Seaford is putting the emphasis on for these other Greek cultural forms that'll come about in the 6th and 5th century.
So moving to the theodicy of money and the market, first I'll work through the Leibnizian architecture of it, because we're going to substitute commodities for monads, each commodity being qualitatively self-enclosed and locked in its use value and capable of communicating with others through any property of its own, and forming a coherent system of equivalences only through money as the transcendent term that pre-establishes harmony, the harmony of the transaction. Money is the philosophical theological apparatus by which qualitative incommensurables are guaranteed commensurable. It's theodicy in the rigorous sense. Money is the principle that's justifying apparent disorder, contingency, qualitative incompatibility by referring to this higher unifying ground, securing rationality. Again, this going towards the invisible hand of providence and the invisible hand of the market. Crucial distinction: the theodicy is operative and not speculative. Leibniz writes this sort of treatise to argue about the best of all possible worlds. Money doesn't need to put forth an argument, right? It constitutes the field as one in which everything is by definition exchangeable, and every exchange is a small theodicy. Heraclitus is anticipating Leibniz, and there's a fragment here that does some structural work. All things are an exchange for fire, and fire for all things, just as goods for gold and gold for goods. And so I think what is interesting is Seaford doesn't talk about Leibniz or Spinoza for that matter, but he does refer to the monism.
He does. Well,
That is part and parcel of the coterminal, or not coterminal, but the coextensive development of the implementation of coinage and what becomes referred to as Greek philosophy, as exemplified by Heraclitus here. Heraclitus is directly correlating cosmic exchange with monetary exchange in the same sentence. This unconscious fusing is manifest. The smoking gun would be the cosmological projection of monetary form caught in the act. The invisible harmony, stronger than the visible. The imminent strife of opposites redeemed by reference to a common substance against which they exchange, right? So one can think about competing interests, let's say, within the marketplace between buyer and seller, or creditor and debtor. There's an antagonism at play at the local level, but there's a universal harmony at play with respect to the general system itself, right? The local disharmony, interestingly, it's a sort of analogous to, once again, the kind of thermodynamics where, or even like the molar and molecular as put forth by Deleuze and Guattari, right? Where at the molecular, there's strife, there's conflict, there's chaos, but at the other end, at the molar, there's an order, right? So it's interesting how those come into play. I don't know if that actually might be something you want to riff on, but
one thing I would riff on is it's interesting when Seaford is able to, along the argument, looking at the development of these pre-Socratic thinkers and how monetization shaped their thinking, because they are some of the first generations born into a world that is already monetized. And so it is what the fragment like you read about fire exchange for things like gold for goods. There's an example not just of projection, which he has been interested in, and how there's a projection of human institutions like coinage into the world of things, into the cosmos. But there's also examples of what he calls deprojection, which again, I don't think he made up, but it's a term that I wasn't familiar with. But it's when there's a way in which what has previously been projected unconsciously is taken conscious stock of and made explicit. And potentially that fragment of Heraclitus could in fact be deprojection, where he is philosophically becoming aware of the fact that the commodification and monetization of the world through human institutions is something taken to be as natural as cosmological exchange of fire.
This is a quote. When there is money, all things run and are driven. So this is the demotic registration of a similar insight where money is not a thing that actually circulates. Money is the principle of generalized circulation itself. Without it, there's qualitative rest, and with it, universal running. So this is like a Spinozan resonance that I want to briefly go through because the grammar is kind of identical in a certain way to Spinoza's conatus, a single principle whose presence constitutes the dynamism of everything that participates in it. You take away the principle and you don't get a different kind of motion. What you get is a qualitative rest or inertia and the privative stillness that the proverb names. For Spinoza, substance is the causa sui, the self-causing, and the modes participate in that self-causation as long as they exist. Universal motion is the metaphysical baseline. So the Heraclitean proverb says the same thing, but locates the cause in the universal running, in money rather than in substance. The implication being that money is the historical social usurper of the position substance occupies for Spinoza's metaphysics. Money running as the quasi-causa sui, sustaining its modes, which would be commodities, labor time, social relations, in their being and motion through its own self-affirmation. Parmenides is the philosophical perfection of this. Being is self-grounded and requiring no kreos. Kreos is debt, I believe, right?
Yeah, debt. It's often translated as necessity.
I don't think Seaford points out the translation issue, but he does in a lecture that I found online, which I found quite
in passing.
compelling.
He brings it out in the Anaximander fragment and in some other. It may or may not be Parmenides. I'd have to look back, but he does point to the fact that kreos or crayon, which is funny, depending on the declension of the noun, is translated usually as necessity, but it also has the meaning of debt. Obviously, a lot of times that debt is taken to be existential, but Seaford wants to put a little bit more emphasis on the fact that in a monetized world, debt also is to be taken literally.
It's operative. Spinoza gives us the philosophical articulation of what immanent self-causation would look like if it weren't money. And this actually has ramifications for our manuscript's anti-theodicy move, because capital's deepest mystification is its presentation as immanent self-causation, right? The form that requires no outside, the principle whose presence constitutes its universal running. What capital wants is to be the Spinozan substance, a substance that needs no master because it is the principle of self-causing motion. It goes back to the kind of Oedipal notion, the Oedipal incestual creation of money begetting money, money becoming filiative. Spinoza, the one philosopher who can name what genuine immanent self-causation would actually be and expose capital's claim as counterfeit. The difference is that substance has no outside to extract from because there is no outside. Money's self-causation is the appearance produced when the dark zone of metabolic conversion is foreclosed from view. Money is a parasitic substance that pretends to be substance proper. And so that's the cosmological projection of the form of monetary exchange itself. The transaction is the social form analog. It functions only because the opposed interests are held in tension without dissolving the transactional coherence. Logos is what holds the tension. And
antamoibe is translated as exchange.
And that's what the tension produces. Heraclitus is articulating this with pretty amazing precision while almost certainly not being aware of what he's really doing, which is the situation that Seaford's whole book is documenting, the unconscious fusion of monetary form with cosmological speculation. So to ground that a little bit more clearly, the way that material practice generates this transcendental or transcendent cosmology. Goes back to my point about Dune, right? It's the Fremen interaction with Arrakis itself and the worms and all of that jazz that is generating their kind of their religion and their immaterial beliefs, the immaterial portions of their culture, the ideal portions of their culture. There's a structural template for capital in the self-valorizing value, MCM prime value as the subject of its own augmentation. Heraclitus works through this before, what is it, chromatastic?
Chromatistic.
Chromatistic accumulation becomes the dominant social form, but he's locating it in the soul. Pressed harder than Seaford would argue it, of course, Heraclitus is putting the self-augmenting logos in the soul because the soul is being formed in this period as the interior duplicate of the universal equivalent forming exteriorly in the agora. There are two surfaces that are forming together. The soul is borrowing from money the structure of impersonal abstract, self-controlling unifier. Money borrows from the soul the structure of inwardness, of depth, and hidden governance. And the two surfaces of the form, interior and exterior, form together. The triple isomorphism Seaford identifies in chapters 7 and 11 and 12 together. Money, the unitary self, and the cosmological substrate share a single logical structure. Money holds the impersonal pole most purely, the universal equivalent that all particular goods participate in, that is made of the totality of exchanges, yet stands over them as their measure. The unitary self holds the personal pole most purely, the I that unifies the manifold of sensations, passions, and body parts, that is made of them, yet stands over them as their controlling center. The cosmological substrate, the apeiron, fire, logos, holds the unstable middle, the boundless substrate from which all determinate things separate out, that is made of the indeterminate possibility of all things, yet steers them. So you can start to see how the invisible hand of the market steers the transaction. It sublimates the local conflict, the local chaotic form for the general good, let's say, for shorthand.
Yeah, and this notion of the apeiron, the limitless, the unlimited, that's an Anaximander term. He's going to make that the, instead of one of the four elements, fire, air, water, earth, or whatever, he's going to make the apeiron kind of the it's going to be the matrix of these four elements. Rather than choosing one of the elements above the others, it's the apeiron. Simondon will go into this when he talks about the apeiron with respect to the pre-individual milieu.
Anaximander's steering is the giveaway here because the impersonal abstract is doing something that requires the grammar of agency or the appearance of an agency, because the form requires the conjunction even though its terms are in opposition or contradictory. These are not three parallel structures, they're a single nested topology. The Homeric self was not unified under a controlling principle. The unitary mind that imposes invisible controlling homogeneous oneness emerges in coordination with the universal equivalent's social emergence. The self form is coeval with the monetary form, not its victim or previous victim.
That's a big point. Seaford goes into that too, is the way in which the pre-Socratics have this, like Parmenides, for example, in his quote unquote deduction of the self-sufficiency of the one, speaking in first person. There's this emergence of the self and emergence of the oneness of the self-sufficiency of the one, in the same way in which there's an emergence of, even the paradox, right, is the impersonality of money allows for the development of individualism outside of the collective redistribution and reciprocity that Homeric society seems to put to the foreground. So yeah, that's an ancillary argument that can easily be missed, is that monetization for Seaford not only gives rise to these pre-Socratic, the diversity of pre-Socratic philosophies, but seems to also coincide with this development of a kind of individualism that may not have taken the same form in a pre-monetary society, right? The heroic in Homer's epic is not the same as the type of individualism we are seeing in the self-sufficiency of the Parmenion one, for example.
In that context, you can think of Ayn Rand, The Virtue of Selfishness, but also something like, what is it? What's the fucking movie with Michael Douglas? Wall Street, right? Greed for lack of a better
Is good.
term is good, right?
Yeah.
And here's a quote that I'm foregrounding with those statements, and that is mutual absolute egotism, governed by logos, accepted by both parties, in conflict yet communal. This is the social form kernel that the cosmology projects and that capital inherits and amplifies. For example, Smith's invisible hand is the cosmic aggregate version of what Cyrus sees in a single transaction. So Cyrus looking at observing the way that coinage exchange or monetary exchange is beginning to emerge in ancient Greece or classical Greece, right? The market doesn't take conflict and convert it into harmony at the macro level. The conversion is already happening at the micro level in every act of buying and selling. Now, there's a temporal point that is worth going through here. And that is, so in terms of oath or the more gift related exchange, the oath binds substantively. Think God's witness. Think about kin enforcing it. Think about the breach of contract or oath being metaphysically legible. In contrast to the contract, where the contract binds formally as an impersonal mechanism that enforces, and breach is calculable as damages, right? So one can sue someone else for breach of contract and extract damages as in the form of a settlement. So that's the conversion that our manuscript, I think, is pointing towards, where substantive bond is reformatted as a formal bond. Kin time, familial time is amortized into chronos, and every contract is a small death of the oath. So why money can't appear as itself without breaking the spell? The transcendent ground has to remain transcendent. When money appears as itself, so MCM prime, financial speculation, or pure self-valorization, the theodicy malfunctions, the ground reveals itself as having its own movement, its own ends. Now that's why Aristotle finds MCM prime disturbing. Not greed, but the form that makes visible the directive function that was supposed to remain hidden. The transcendent ground was supposed to secure the immanent order. When it begins to use the immanent order for its own self-realization, theodicy collapses into something that would be closer to demonology. So if you think of like capital as the demiurge.
In Gnosticism, right? There's the evil god.
Really brings into sharp relief the theodical element of it, right? And we could point to someone like Hayek being the most articulate modern.
The priest of the evil god.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the market is omniscient. It aggregates information no individual possesses. It's omnipotent. It coordinates what no authority can command. It's benevolent. It directs resources towards their most efficient uses. And that's theodicy in a precise theological sense. The justification of God's ways to man. Capital's theodicy operates identically to this because there's apparent inefficiency, equality, suffering being the instruments of a higher efficiency the invisible hand works towards. So the job loss to automation is a local disruption that serves global optimization. The deindustrialized community is collateral damage in the march towards comparative advantage. Suffering is real, but local. Harmony is virtual, but total. I think this is interesting in the way that, for example, the Protestant believer trusts sovereign grace even when visible evidence contradicts it. The market believer trusts sovereign efficiency even when visible evidence contradicts it. Both require a faith in the transcendent harmony whose workings the finite mind cannot access.
I might even add on more to this Protestant point. In early American literature, it's not just the discrepancy between belief in sovereign grace and the hardships being undergone. It's the very fact that shit is difficult that things are not going their way, that means that God is like testing them and choosing them. So the disparity between what's happening on the ground and the hardships one is going through is actually proof that God has chosen you for this journey, this quest. You can see that through early American literature.
What's the meme? God giving his greatest challenges.
Mhm.
I forget what the fuck it is.
His greatest soldiers, his hardest challenges, and all that shit. Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
So I want to mobilize Simondone's hylomorphism here because it gives us a diagnostic in looking at this, because the master sees a form, the mold design, the plan, and a passive matter, clay or labor, and conceives the operation as the imposition of form on the latter, so form on matter. What remains dark is the operational reality of the brick making itself, the metastable state of the clay, the transduction by which the clay's internal forces conduct themselves into form, the internal resonances. The master's commanding position is constituted by his structural inability to see the operation that he commands. This is the structure of the commodity fetish, where capital appears as the active directing principle and labor appears as passive material. The fetish not being loose ideology, it's the philosophical structure of capital's self-presentation, and that structure itself is hylomorphic. So the theodicy holds because the dark zone is foreclosed from the position from which the harmony is perceptible. The price system really does aggregate information. The market really does produce a kind of order. From the command position, the coordination is genuinely miraculous. So the theodicy isn't simply false. It's a manifest surface whose latent content, the dark zone, is constitutively excluded from the position of the believer, right? So this is why, going back to the notion of the market believer or the Protestant believer, right? They trust sovereign grace even when visible evidence contradicts it, or they trust market efficiency even when visible evidence contradicts it. Markets are rational. The oil futures market is it's adequately pricing the substrate of actual physical oil being considered whenever oil futures prices are being determined in terms of the transactions that are taking place from a market standpoint, right? So you can see this playing out in real time, right? There's an invisible dark zone that is at play, I think. This is interesting. Things, quote, pay penalty and recompense to one another for their injustice according to the assessment of time. So that's the cosmological projection of debt relations themselves, where existence takes on a kind of owedness, and time is the assessor of the debts that are being paid. There's a fragment about Parmenides here where sublimation is sort of, I would say, loosely perhaps caught in the act. And this is referred to by Seaford in a lecture. The fragment asks why being would have come into existence at one moment rather than another. The standard translation, what need would have driven it later or earlier, beginning from nothing to grow. Seaford offers the corrective that we mentioned earlier, that being that it's not need, but debt. The right reading being what debt would have called being forth. So Parmenides is asking why being would have come into existence at one moment rather than another, beginning from nothing. The debt reading makes the question precise. What owedness could have summoned being out of non-being? What creditor would being have owed itself to before being existed? The answer is none. Therefore, being did not come to be. Therefore, being is ungenerated and eternal. The negative answer to the Kreos question is the philosophical proof of being's eternity. This is the moment that monetary cosmology becomes so saturated that even the philosophical articulation of pure self-grounding being has to pass through the debt question in order to ground itself. The metaphysical structure of the Parmenidean being is articulated through the vocabulary of debt relations, even when the conclusion is that no debt could account for being. The debt frame is the operative grammar, even where it's being negated. So this is the completion of the Moira to Crayon to Anankes. Is it Anankes? Is that right?
Ananke, yeah.
Anaximander's Cosmos Still Owes. Parmenides asks the debt question and answers it in the negative, which lets him sublimate Kreos. This is the philosophical analog of money's own development from coin currency that still bears qualitative traces, the imprint of the polis, the metal's value, the divine sanction towards pure abstract value substance that shed all qualitative determination. The pre-Socratic sequence is the cosmological history of monetary abstraction. This becomes the proto-formulation of what Christian theology will sublimate as creation as debt to creator, what capital will operationalize as the universal mortgageability of finite life. If Cosmos owes, what gets accumulated when it pays? Hopefully we'll be able to get to that in thread 3. Thread 3 is going to be hauntology, the market, and the primal father. There's a passage in chapter 14 that Seaford gives us. All that remains of the ancestors, they are the pieces of money, the progressive wearing out of all things, of which in the end no trace remains except these pieces of money. Money as the all-powerful accomplices of time, money as the tangible supporters of the law. This gives us an ontological structure that's exact. Money is the immortal remainder that persists through the mortality of everything else, people, goods, and cultural objects themselves. I would maybe substitute capital for money here, and the mortality of people, goods, and cultural objects would be akin to something like dead labor. So dead labor persists as the stable dead form of mortality while being the condition of their circulation. You could maybe say that this would be something like Deleuze's pure past, but materialized, where money is the virtual ground that was never present as such, and it conditions every present exchange without being consumed by any of them, and it accumulates as the society's own immortality, while everything mortal passes through it. The all-powerful accomplices of time. Money is not outside time, but simply eternal. It is time's accomplice. It works with time's destructive passage rather than against it. The mortality of persons and goods is not money's enemy, but its generative condition. Things wear out, people die, goods are consumed, and money remains as the distilled remainder of all that passing. So things wearing out, think amortization. Money accumulates immortality through the very process by which everything loses it in terms of the metabolism of the qualitative or living labor, for example. Dead labor is money's accomplice in the same sense. Each metabolic expenditure is leaving behind a monetary remainder that persists and accumulates. And the gradient, as we argue, steepens because money is time's accomplice and living labor is time's victim. Call back to thread 1 here. The Lydian dowry coin is the prototype. The body wears out in the brothel. The coin remains. The dowry persists as the remainder of an exchange in which the body was the N-1. Call back to the Iliad, where Achilles' refusal, no wealth equals his, is it push?
Okay.
Puke.
Suke is his soul or his life.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. We call it psyche today, but Suke, yeah.
The psyche, in his words, cannot be plundered or captured to come back again. Achilles here names what the monetary form will spend millennia denying. The one exchange that cannot be recuperated is the metabolic crossing that admits no return. The psyche crossing the barrier of the teeth on a payment schedule. Moving on to hauntology. For Derrida, the specter is neither present nor absent. Money as ancestral remainder is exactly this. It's not the living ancestor, not simply absent. It's the immortal piece that circulates in the ancestor's place and that carries the law without the body. The quote-unquote tangible supporters of the law. Money as the material form of the symbolic order. The coins as the physical instantiation of the name of the Father that persists after the Father's body has been worn away. Lacan's symbolic order is the monetary order in its most developed form. The implicit immortality maintained by explicit mortality here. The society achieves its immortality through the mortality of the persons and goods that crosses its path. Immortality is not despite mortality, but through it, by means of it. So each death, each consumption, each wearing out contributes to the immortal remainder that pieces of money would embody. And society is a machine for converting mortality into immortality, and money is the distillate. This is where Bataille's The Cursed Share is revealed in its anthropological form, where restricted economy is a mortality processing machine that converts expenditure into immortal remainder. The accursed share isn't wasted. It's laundered through mortality into monetary immortality. So again, living labor, for example, is converted into immortal dead labor. Freud's group psychology is actually sharpened by Seaford here as well, where Freud has the structure, but he doesn't quite ground it in the same capacity. The group constitutes the leader as its ego ideal and projects onto him the omnipotence it has surrendered. What this can explain is why this specific figure and why this specific moment. What Seaford gives us is the historical determination. The tyrannical figure becomes the screen for projected desire at the historical moment when monetary individualization has produced both the desire and the necessity of its repression simultaneously. The Athenian citizen is projecting itself onto the tyrant because money has already installed unlimited autonomy as a desire, while civic and kinship codes would still require its suppression. Enviable but horrifying, which is Seaford's phrase, it's not a psychological accident, but it's a structural necessity. The citizen envies what the tyrant has actualized. He is horrified at its cost, though: the destruction of kinship bonds, the robbing of temples, and the incestuous circuit taken to its conclusion. We can think of Oedipus as monetary tyrant. Oedipus actually refers to himself as homogenes, quote, of the same family as those from whom he was born. Now, this is not just irony. The monetary tyrant's ontological self-description is, I am my own ground, I am self-reproducing, I am homogeneous with my own origins, I need no outside to reproduce. The tyrant's monetary self-sufficiency is the social form of Oedipus's homogenes. If you think back to group psychology and the analysis of the ego, right? Freud refers to the poet and how the poet sort of he tries to say, illustrate that the hero is responsible for the acts of the group. So the hero acts as the ego ideal. Something interesting too, right? As that Freud refers to the poet as like the first individual or something like that. So I'll be sure to link that episode in the show notes as well. Here's another phrase from Seaford that is very interesting here. So money takes on the seeming self-sufficiency of its owner. The mutual constitution runs both directions, because the owner appears self-sufficient because money does, and money appears self-sufficient because its owner does. Seaford scales this directly to the cosmological, where the monetary tyrant is unprecedentedly autonomous. I'll just say this again. The monetary tyrant is, quote unquote, unprecedentedly autonomous deity of Xenophanes.
Xenophanes, yeah.
Xenophanes.
Yeah, that's a lesser known pre-Socratic philosopher who is kind of talking about this self-sufficient God in a way that we saw with Parmenides' self-sufficient one, but it's much more blatant.
So the narcissistic tyrant scaled onto the cosmological level. Money's self-sufficiency is projected into the divine realm. The Oedipal qualities are not heroic virtues in the Iliadic sense. Energy, decisiveness, self-confidence, intelligence, versatility, they're entrepreneurial virtues. Oedipus is the first bourgeois subject, self-made, mobile, meritocratic, and solving problems through his own individual intelligence rather than inherited position or divine favor. The Mausian or Mosian resonance here is that money has no master. Simultaneously true, and the most complete ideological mystification is that money has no master because it is the master. because it has absorbed mastery into itself as impersonal form. The slave who works for wages experiences no master because the monetary form has replaced that personal relation of domination with an impersonal one. And that's hylomorphic mystification at its most complete, where the form giver has dissolved directly into the form. I think an interesting symptom of this would be the way that I spoke earlier about the sovereign's face or likeness appearing on coinage. I think there's no sort of accident for why that even persists today. Moses' point about magical efficacy is the magician's power is real, but not located in the person of the magician. It's constituted in the collective agreement that the gesture commands the result. Mana is real because participation in the agreement is what produces its effect. Money has no master in exactly that same sense, where the form's mastery is real, but its location is collective. The collective belief in money's value isn't a derivative ideological add-on, it's the constitutive form of its operation, of the form's operation. Demystification, or showing that money is really just a social relation, never actually dissolves that libidinal investment, because the investment isn't cognitive, it's structural in the sense that magical efficacy is structural for most. The form works because participation in the form is what makes it work. That's why monetary crises aren't failures of belief in the ordinary sense, but withdrawals of participation. So again, this calls back to Freud's group psychology, right? Because once the panic? He refers to panic or something like that?
Yeah.
Dissolving the group. So there's a very similar analogous relationship that goes there, right? The magic stops working when the collective agreement that constitutes its working comes apart. So very much like the way that the leader operates for Freud in that essay, or in that book rather. Dead labor commands living labor with no master in sight. Machinery runs itself, the market allocates, and prices coordinate. The impersonality of money is the phenomenological surface of what's structurally the command of accumulated dead labor over living labor. And that really is one of the primary things that we are trying to investigate in the manuscript. So interestingly here, the primal father returns as the form. Freud's primal father was murdered precisely because he monopolized jouissance. The son's murder of the primal father establishes exogamy as the founding social law, so the categorical imperative of the prohibition against incest. But money is the son's way of secretly reinstating the primal father's monopoly in this impersonal form, where M to M, so instead of MCM prime, it's M to M, so the incestuous reproduction or fility of nature of money or capital is the primal father's reproductive logic that survives the murder. That's the hauntology, right? The ghost that keeps the circuit closed even after the body that enforced it has actually been dissolved and metabolized by the sons, when the son's devouring the body of the tyrant, of the primal father. Oedipus doesn't know he's reinstated the primal father structure because the monetary form has rendered it invisible, impersonal, and natural. Empedocles, Spheros, and the death drive. Seaford on Empedocles, quote, the undifferentiated universe rejoicing in its supremely joyful solitariness. Quote, coextensiveness is also the most extreme personal isolation. The maximal expansion of the self to coincide with everything is simultaneously the maximal closure of the self onto itself. The universe that contains everything needs nothing from the outside. Again, has resonances with Freud's group psychology, because the narcissistic leader doesn't need the love of his followers. He's high on his own supply, right? It's the M to M, right? Because the primal father hoards all of the jouissance. He copulates with the daughters and hoards all the women and reproduces himself without need for the sons. That's the tyrant's self-sufficiency. The form of the good being the good beyond being. The monetary subject's dream of unlimited acquisition, which points to Seaford's phrase, limited only by the amount of money possessed, and pushed to the cosmological absolute. This is also the death drive's cosmological form. So for Freud and the nirvana principle, is the elimination of all tension, the undifferentiated, spheros as libidinal telos, the plutocrat's jouissance is the infant's jubilierung pushed to its terminal point. And this will bridge us into our final thread 4. The primal father returns as the form. Then the form is doing something more than mediating. It's generating its own referent. And so that's where Baudrillard actually becomes precise.
It's interesting that the self-sufficiency is not just found in Empedocles, but also in Parmenides, this notion of the self-enclosed sphere that, has no need of anything else outside of it. I will say it's a very base analogy, but the sphere could very well, Seaford does a pretty good reading of it back to mystic initiations. And as you mentioned, it's with the genesis of selfhood as we kind of consider it. The other thing too is the coin itself, right, would be somewhat equivalent with the spheros, with the sphere, the self-enclosed entity that of its own accord is, and the dark zone being the desires and beliefs, the fiduciarity of the community that invests it with the conventional value it has. But because of that dark zone, it seems self-sufficient, right? That the coins have eternity, even in wear and tear as a physical object, they retain their value. They not only have general equivalence with commodities because they can be exchanged for it, but they each possess their own conventional value outside of the metals of which they are composed, right? So they are equivalent with each other. And as you were pointing out, they can render the user powerful and self-sufficient insofar as they are hoarded. Seaford has this refrain that I found was interesting. I would love to read more about it. He kept saying how the monetization we think of, that we do have to make steps to get to what we would think of as capital, because he kept saying how the Greeks had this inclination or habit or cultural standard to hoard coins and wealth of that sort rather than quote unquote invest it. I think that would be a thread I would love to see more on, whether or not Seaford takes that up in his later works, because I know his later works do build off of this work. I would be curious to see the empirical evidence or the historical evidence that he's drawing on. And he probably has a citation that I just overlooked, but about how the Greeks were much more prone to hoard these coins than to invest it like we might think of today in a capitalist society proper. He's not projecting capitalism fully back onto the Greeks. And that was one of the refrains that he kept coming back to. The hoarding of the coins was important for his argument rather than the investment of them. And I thought that was very interesting.
I'll try to move through this fairly quickly and probably cut off a significant portion of the remainder. But I do want to at least get briefly into this simulation and hyperreality content, where Baudrillard is sort of offered a correction by Seaford, where I'll work through first the 3 orders of simulacra from symbolic exchange and death. First, the counterfeit, where the signed is still bound to referent, however, it's imperfectly bound. Second, production, the sign as a serial copy without original. So think industrial reproduction. Third, simulation, the sign proceeds and produces its referent. The model generates the real. So what Baudrillard does is present the simulation as this late modern or postmodern achievement. But what I believe, my argument is that Seaford corrects this, where the monetary sign is already operative in the 3rd order from the very beginning, right? The arbitrary sign doesn't pass through counterfeit and production before achieving simulation. Money achieves pure simulation almost immediately because the abstract value it signifies is itself produced by the signifying operation. There's no monetary referent that the coin represents. Value is constituted by the circulation of the sign and not pre-given.
This is what I was saying to you, like, do the coins create the fiduciarity, the belief and desire, and their conventional value outweighing their use value? Or is it not the fact that coins are like, do they make it possible, or is it not the desired belief that already endows coinage with a need for existing? This is not necessarily something that Seaford directly talks about, but he at least, no, he doesn't formulate the problem in that way. He doesn't. I don't think it's a problem for him. He at least gives us the means for talking about it.
All that to say that hyperreality isn't the late development of capitalism but its originary condition. Capital is already beginning in simulation, and it doesn't arrive there through passing through representation. So we can look at Saussure as the belated theorist of a monetized semiotics through this lens, where his claim of arbitrariness and that the sign produces its referent rather than representing a pre-given one. This is the claim that abstract value has no existence outside of the signifying system of monetary circulation, meaning being produced by differential relations between signs rather than a correspondence to external referents. He discovered this language because he was already living inside a monetary semiotics that had been operating since the ancient Greeks. His structuralism is the belated theoretical articulation of what money had already been doing, right? Similar argument to kind of what I think Brothel would say with respect to Kant and the categories of perception or yada yada. Looking at our structuralist family here, Saussure, Levi-Strauss, and Lacan, they inherit a monetary semiotics that they universalize as the structure of signification as such, thereby concealing the specifically monetary genealogy of the categories that they take as universal. What I'm going to argue is that Heraclitean logos would be the first hyperreal. Heraclitus insists statues are not gods, being the first explicit theorization of third-order simulacrum. The statue has been confused with its referent. The magical symbol identified with what it signifies. Heraclitus performs the semiotic cut, but the cut, as Seaford illustrates, is monetarily conditioned. It becomes thinkable because the coin has already performed it in a practical sense. And once performed, the cut immediately reinstalls the simulacrum at a higher level. The logos as universal equivalent, distinct from everything, yet accounting for everything, is already a simulation of monetary abstraction at the metaphysical level. Applying Baudrillard's deepest point retroactively, the critique of the simulacrum always generates a new simulacrum. Plato critiques commercial money only to produce the form of the good as the ultimate simulation. Value beyond being generates being as its copy. Each critical move up the ladder of abstraction is simultaneously a deeper move into the hyperreal. We can look at the mirror stage as a monetary artifact. So I think Seaford grounds the mirror stage. He explicitly grounds the mirror stage in monetary history. He says, relative to monetary possession, allowing adult subjects to, quote unquote, unconsciously reenact the joyful sense of incipient power he felt as an infant in the formation of the unitary subject. Money is the adult mirror stage, the social mechanism that reproduces the misrecognition at the level of the police rather than the nursery. The mirror stage is therefore not a universal feature of human development in the form that Lacan describes. It achieves its specific modern form only under these monetary conditions. The pre-monetary subject dispersed into seals and gifts and kinship obligations didn't experience fragmentation as threatening in the same way because the self wasn't constituted as self-contained to begin with. Monetary abstraction's three-step operation. First, produces the expectation of self-containment, then produces the anxiety of fragmentation relative to this expectation, then offers itself as the cure. The coin in the pocket as the external coherence that resolves the fragmentation the monetary subject is constitutively threatened by. Metaphorically, capital sells the disease and the remedy simultaneously, and that operation is installed at the deepest level of subject formation. Monetary abstraction produces the self-contained autonomous subject, no longer dispersed into magical objects, and this is the production of the original hyperreal subject. The bounded self is not discovered by money, but simulated by money. A model of interiority and self-possession that precedes and produces the experience of having an inside or an interiority. If you think about Descartes' cogito being the philosophical articulation of a subject that money had been producing historically, the pure interiority, the res cognitans without extension, perfectly self-identical across time and persons, sounds like money, right? Again, the immortality of money, immortality of substance. That's the human form of the monetary unit. Yeah, so I think we can probably close there. I just want to throw it to you if you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up the episode.
I'm glad that I don't want to say step outside the comfort zone because it's the disciplinary comfort zone, right? I mean, this is something that is much more a work of a historian, of as you said, classicist. That's a good word for him. I think that in his YouTube talk that we both looked at, I mean, he says he's not himself a philosopher, but he is asking these sort of philosophical questions. He's also not well versed in Marx, but he's asking somewhat Marxian questions too. So it's nice to read a text that has I mean, in the best sense of the word, has a very interdisciplinary aspect to it. It's cutting across ancient literature, philosophy, cultural forms, art, history. So it's a very nice blend of the empirical and the speculative that kind of goes to the heart of a lot of these other thinkers that we've been investigating ourselves. And so it seemed like a extremely timely book to look into. And I think it's very interesting, and I would recommend it to the reader. And also just say that you pointed out, if the reader is interested more in maybe the philosophical arguments or the arguments concerning philosophy's origins and the question of monetization related to it, you can start around chapter 8 or 9. But I would suggest the whole of the book is nicely rhizomatic because he refers forward and backward in the argument to the sections and chapters that have the relevant material. So you can kind of open it up and jump in at any point and move around in it as you might see fit. And I thought that was a nice way of writing his work, to self-reference more argumentation when needed.
One thing that I didn't discuss in depth that I wish I had earlier was the correspondence between monetary exchange and the sacrifice as it pertains to Greek religious practices and the communal bond of the sacrificial animal, the totem animal, one might even argue, or this could be a historical development of antecedent of totemism. But the consumption of the animal and the egalitarian distribution of the sacrificial meal, the totemic meal itself, persistence of this in the exchange of money, right? There's a democratizing social bond that is offered by both the totemic meal and the exchange of coin, and the coin sort of taking on the symbol of the sacrificial totemic meal itself. And I think that is quite interesting. But there's also, again, I think maybe the biggest takeaway, unexpected takeaway from the book that I have is how directly it corresponds with what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as the decoding of flows.
Yes.
And I think that's what I'm ultimately pointing to relative to the totemic meal and monetary exchange, because interestingly, there's a way that the communal aspect of the totemic meal gives way, even though there's a certain persistence of communal egalitarian nature of the exchange of coin or monetary exchange, there's also subsequently a disconnect of the social, where social obligation and reciprocity themselves begin to become detached, and the equivalence of minds, bodies, and things has ramifications that are gestating in an early evolution of what later gets usurped by capital.
Yep.
And so I just want to highlight that for the reader or listener or both.
The other thing you brought up, sacrifice. He has that in chapter 3. He goes deeper into the roots of sacrifice, the pre-coinage roots for sacrifice, why it's important to look at. And one of the things that I had never heard of, what I thought was interesting, is sort of before the minting of coins, one of the things that could have or did have a money function was the sacrificial spits, the iron spits for the animals. And obviously they would by no means be standardized in weight or material, or and they wouldn't be as easily transportable, right? We're talking about, I mean, it's like moving a ladder around as currency, but it is interesting that they had a storage of value function, the spits used to hoist the animals in the sacrifice. And I had never heard that, and I thought that was fascinating. So
I'm not making this up, but I want to say that there was also fragments of the bones of the sacrificial animal that were maybe involved too in a similar fashion.
well, I think he talks about them being mixed, the ash and bone being found in the altars, but also even buried in tombs. The tomb as the store of wealth and fame from the heroic Homeric epic times. Some of these sacrificial implements, including the spits and the bones of the animals and yada yada, those themselves had some type of communal value. And so I think that the pre-soil for money to come about, the conditions of possibility for it, right? Obviously in religion and religious beliefs, but also in sacrificial rites and rituals, those are part of the heady cocktail that come together to form the necessary beliefs and desires for the disparity of conventional value over the use value that fiduciarity is conceptualizing. Because how does coin money become an institution? Well, already you would have had the beliefs and desires collectively developed over generations and generations with shared storytelling and myth, ritual and religion, and as you pointed out, reciprocal, equitable distribution of the feast. That's a veritable collective assemblage of enunciation, as Guattari would talk about. You need that collective assemblage of enunciation to have the other side of the assemblage, the material side of coins. You would have had to have that semiotic layer beforehand, and the coherence, coalescence of beliefs and desires to make coinage possible.
Brilliant way to wrap up the episode. I think that'll be all for this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.